Well, the appointed hour having arrived, let us begin. Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to the University of St. Francis. Welcome to the first of the lectures in the series from the Department of Philosophy and Theology, of which I am the chair, Adam DeVille. So I'm happy to start off the season. We've got, I think, a diversity of topics this year, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of them. The handout that I gave you gives you the outline for the talk, some additional reading materials if you wanted to go into further depth or detail about some of the authors I'm mentioning. And then the very last page, the back page, has got the flyer for the reproduction of the flyer for the remaining lectures this fall. And then some early words on the lectures and roundtables for the spring. And when those dates for the spring get finalized, as I hope they will in the next few weeks, we will post those on the website, and then there'll be mailings about those as well, so that you can come and follow those. So tonight, fake news and the fathers of suspicion, learning from Freud, Marx, and Evagrius. One of these things is not like the other, as the Sesame Street jingle of my childhood used to go. The phrase fathers of suspicion or masters of suspicion is usually attributed to Paul Ricoeur, who used it to refer to Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. I shall address the first two of this triumvirate tonight, but I've swapped out a third, far less well-known figure, at least in the modern period, namely Evagrius of Pontus, who was in his day and for centuries afterwards perhaps the most influential monastic writer of the late antique period. His writings on the logismi, that is on what he called disordered thoughts, which are connected to disordered desires and actions, are, I shall argue, a natural pairing for what Marx and Freud have to say. It also happens, truth be told, that I've read far more of Evagrius than I have of Nietzsche, so I am perhaps on safer grounds in doing this. So in what follows tonight, I want to leave as much time as we can at the end for discussion, but how things are going to unfold. I'm going to proceed in two ways and via four sections, again outlined for you. The first way is a series of methodological reflections on how and why to engage people like Marx and Freud and Evagrius, for that matter. And then after that, we'll get into a kind of a descriptive section looking at what Evagrius has to say and trying to unpack some of those things. All of this, all three of these figures are engaged, pressed into service to try and answer two questions. How do our desires go astray, becoming disordered and irrational, a species of fake news about ourselves in which we are deceived by ourselves, and sometimes by others, into thinking we want a lesser good, which distracts us from the common good and our ultimate good, who is God? And then the second question, what do we do to heal those desires when they go astray? How can we bring them back into a right and rational ordering, or economia? So, despoiling the Egyptians, how to engage Marx and Freud. But before we get to even that question, there is a preliminary question that I think we need to deal with, and that's the question of why. Too many Christians for much of the last century and more could not come up with reasons why Marx and Freud should be engaged, and instead have done little more than snort and scoff whenever their names were mentioned. They were often disdainfully dismissed not for what they actually wrote, but for the grotesques they have become in the reactionary imaginations of those whose sole knowledge of either Marx or Freud is derived from some fourth-hand, hackneyed bit of apologetics they read on some blog, or in some penny tract snatched from the rack at the back of the church. Christians such as this have never bestirred themselves to read either Marx or Freud in the original primary texts. And as a result, they've allowed themselves to be fooled into treating both Marx and Freud as the great boogeymen of the last century, the materialists who were obsessed with sex and money, respectively, and have no time for God. A second, no less shabby tactic comes from those Christians and others who fail to grasp the basic principle, abusus non tollit usum. Merely because Freud or Marx has been abused by their followers does not mean that they are not still useful to us in some limited ways and do not still have something valuable to contribute. In other words, it's of no relevance at all to stand up and say, yes, but the Soviet Union or Maoist China or Castro's Cuba slaughtered millions of Christians, So we cannot possibly have anything to learn from Marx. We're not talking about Soviet, Chinese, or Cuban communism tonight. We're talking a little bit about Marx, the philosopher, especially the philosopher of the 1840s, long before any of those failed, destructive, and disastrous experiments were attempted in Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean. So dismissals of Marx based on what people claim to be doing in his name decades after he died are not very interesting. Intellectual history, in fact, is littered with examples of people whose reputation and work has been traduced by those coming after them, resulting in unjust treatment. In fact, Evagrius is one such figure from Christian history. For centuries, a soupçon of heresy hung around Evagrius like stale cigar smoke. That is, Evagrius has often been accused of being an Origenist, that is, a follower of Origen of Alexandria. Though here too we have the problem in spades, because we have to ask ourselves, did Origen himself actually believe the things that people after he died said he believed? Or did his enemies attribute things to him, a kind of a variety of fake news, long before that phrase was coined and regularly used by Donald Trump to describe CNN and the New York Times? Now, we're going to leave Origen out of this, but we can say safely that Evagrius has been cleared of all charges. That recent scholarship by Augustine Cassidy, who happens to be a friend of mine, has convincingly demonstrated that the suspicions that hung around Evagrius as to what he said and did cannot be attributed to him, but came long after he was dead. And people tried to pin these things on him, oftentimes to deflect heat from their own reputations. So Evagrius is a worthwhile figure to engage. But what about Marx and Freud? Why should Catholic and other Christians still engage these two people today? There is, of course, the simple and perhaps over-obvious answer that they remain two of the most influential intellectuals of the last 2 centuries, and they still command vast attention. The bibliographies by and about both are vast, with many of their books runaway bestsellers that have never been out of print. So whether Christians and Catholics like it or not, whether we agree with Marx and Freud or not, the world we live in has been influenced by them in ways that are almost incalculable. Perhaps then a sharper question is why in 2017, nearly 80 years after Freud's death and almost 140 years after Marx's death, and after decades of widespread engagement of both thinkers by Christians and non-Christians alike, generating vast literatures of secondary literature, why should we continue to engage them? In other words, is there anything in 2017 that we still need to learn? Is there anything that we have not yet learned? Is there anything that we could learn in a new way from both of them? As I hope to show in a small way tonight, there is. What is that, in brief? What is it we might still need to learn or want to learn from Marx and Freud? This is not my own question. This is a question that was suggested to me earlier this year by reading Alistair McIntyre's newest book, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. McIntyre, widely regarded as perhaps the preeminent moral philosopher of our time, argues that the Marx of the 1840s still has something to teach us, and that Freud of his early and middle periods also has something to teach us. That is, I would say, before the books of the last 15 years of Freud's life, from the mid-1920s to his death in 1939. The books in that period at the end of his life are very different from his earlier books. In those late books, Freud sets himself the task of becoming a cultural commentator and critic and an ethnologist manqué, in both of which roles I think he failed nobly. So the earlier Freud and the earlier Marx have something to teach us, McIntyre suggests, about the nature of our desires, and when and how those desires go astray, and when and how they're often subtly and unconsciously exploited by the moneymakers, the power brokers, and the media owners of advanced capitalist nation-states, even to the point of invading and eroding Christianity from within. So it's the question of desire that we're going to look at tonight. There's another methodological question that often gets raised when we talk about these two figures, and that is, these are two erstwhile lapsed Jewish thinkers who openly rejected Christianity and indeed monotheism or theism in general. They've been categorized as, and in some places describe themselves as, atheists. So what do we have to learn from such people as that? I think there are places in the early life of both Marx and Freud where they're not only sympathetic to Christianity, but I think there's, especially in Freud's case, even a certain envy of some things within the Christian tradition. This comes out if you read the 30-year-long correspondence that Freud carried on with Oskar Pfister, who was a pastor, a Reformed pastor in Switzerland, who was also a practicing psychoanalyst and a great, great fan of Freud. In those letters, which are remarkably gracious and elegantly written on Freud's part, he doesn't at all pour scorn on Pfister's faith. He doesn't at all call him names. He doesn't at all mock his faith. In fact, what I detect in those letters is a little bit of envy, in fact, because Pfister has a moral vision of the world that holds together, that coheres in a way that Freud does not. And there's a certain longing for that in some ways. So Freud is not a hostile person out to destroy faith. Let us, however, plainly admit that some of the critique of Christianity by both Marx and Freud has merit, that they are critics. Freud especially, I don't think, wants to destroy Christianity or destroy people's faith like Oskar Pfister or even some of his patients, but they are critical comments that are made by both. And I would argue that we should thank both men in some ways, because some of their criticisms are necessary and useful and good. In other words, let us agree with Marx and Freud that appeals to God have sometimes been used in a reactionary fashion to thwart legitimate desires for legitimate socioeconomic and political change, or to give cover to various forms of abuse and exploitation, whether sexual, economic, political, or psychological. To the extent that Freud and Marx have helped us be aware of these abuses of Christian theology to prevent real-life injustices from being remedied, and to the extent that Freud in particular has helped us to see how often we project onto God neurotic and infantile images of fatherhood, Christians ought to thank both men for these and other important services rendered and necessary critiques made. Those who have at least some passing familiarity with the Old Testament will recognize that God is not above using those who reject or hate him to critique and scourge his chosen people. Let us equally, however, posit that much of the critique of Marx and Freud made by Christians and others also has very considerable merit. Great men are invariably flawed, as are we all, and there are large flaws in both Marxist and Freudian thought. I will not entertain those here tonight, but I just want to stipulate that at the outset, that we're aware that there are many problems, but there still remains something good. So let's leave aside worries about can we engage atheists, can we engage critics. Let's leave that aside. Let's ask instead how we can engage people like this. And there's a phrase attributed to and used by many of the church fathers when they talk about despoiling the Egyptians. That's how they engage the critics of their own day. What does that phrase mean? Well, the phrase comes from Exodus, the book of Exodus, in the context of the enslavement of Israel by and in Egypt. As the Lord is outlining to Moses his plan of his people's liberation, he tells Moses that each woman shall ask of her neighbor and of her who sojourns in her house jewelry of silver and gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you shall despoil the Egyptians. That's the 3rd chapter of Exodus. What is clear here is that this is a strategy for taking the best, right? Silver and gold. It therefore requires a certain degree of discernment. I have to recognize, first of all, what is silver, what is gold, and what is not. What is fake? I have to be able to tell the difference. This suggests to us, then, that despoiling Freud, Marx, or 1,000 other figures and their ideas is bound on two sides by two very clear pitfalls that we must not do. Neither an absolute and unthinking acceptance, nor an absolute and unthinking rejection. That is, the Catholic mind, the mind that seeks to despoil non-Catholic thinkers, has to use a degree of discernment in seeking out what is best in them. In that process of discernment, are there other guidelines or methods that will help us to look where and for what? Are there other methods that we can use to test out the soundness of arguments from Freud, Marx, and others. Indeed, there are, and here I turn from the patristic period to the medieval, locating what I would call very valuable Thomistic methods. Now, I'm not a Thomist, because I haven't read enough of the man to know what that phrase might entail. But what I have read and long admired about Thomas Aquinas is how superbly he also despoils not just Egyptians, but Greek philosophers, Aristotle among them. And he does so via his very carefully laid out dialectical method of argumentation. The way much of his argumentation unfolds is by first stipulating a thesis that he wants to demonstrate or argue or prove. And then immediately below that, listing the counterclaims from his opponent to the thesis. And he does so in a way that is very, very careful. Thomas takes care, as any Catholic thinker must, to recognize that one's opponents may in fact have very good arguments. Indeed, my opponent's arguments may be better than my own, and I need to learn valuable things from my opponent. If I fail to do so, then as McIntyre demonstrated decades ago, I leave myself vulnerable to an epistemological crisis and the dangers of my opponent's arguments winning the day, causing my own arguments to be refuted and dissolve. Even if in this act of sorting and discerning, my opponent's arguments turn out to be weak and flawed, Thomas still has enough respect for them and their author to state them very carefully. There's no fake news in Thomas. When he's describing Aristotle, he really does want to try and describe Aristotle so much and so clearly and so carefully that Aristotle himself, if he were in the room, would stand up and say, yes, that's exactly what I said. Now, why does he do that? Why does Thomas go to such elaborate lengths to state things so carefully and accurately that his opponents will say, yes, that's right, I can't argue with how you've portrayed my views. You've done a perfect job. Why does he do that? Thomas does that instead of the cheap polemics or the hostile tweet or the silencing slogan and sneer, you peddle fake news, you're a racist, you're a homophobe. He doesn't engage in those kinds of tactics, right? Why not? Ultimately, the answer to that question is for Thomas as it is for us theological. Thomas is not just dressing up as Aristotle, right? He can fling off the Aristotelian costume when he's done. In treating his opponents the way he does, I think he's making two theological points, albeit perhaps obliquely. First, God himself is to be found in Aristotle, as well as in Freud and Marx and every other human being who's ever lived. For they and all of us are created in the image and likeness of God and deserve respect on that basis alone. But we at this university pride ourselves on one of the 5 Franciscan values, right? Respect the unique dignity of every human person. So Thomas recognizes that and tries to put it into practice. But he does a second thing. He reminds us of perhaps the most difficult demand of the gospel, to love one's enemies. And to love your opponent in a debate means you have to tell the truth. St. Paul makes it very clear that love and truth go together. You cannot tell the truth in a way that is not loving. Now, of course, being merely created in the image and likeness of God does not give a pass to Aristotle or Freud or Marx. It doesn't guarantee that everything they say is great. God gives life and gives dignity to them, but intelligence requires work on their part and on ours. And merely because you love your enemy doesn't magically turn him or her into a better reasoner. So while Thomas respects Aristotle, draws on Aristotle, agrees with Aristotle in parts, he also goes beyond Aristotle. He corrects Aristotle or flat out disagrees with Aristotle. He's seeking out the gold and silver, right? What's good and what's not. And he's leaving the rest aside. So in that regard, he's not just despoiling the Egyptians, but he's also following St. Paul's counsel to the Thessalonians, test everything, hold fast to what is good. Testing takes time, it requires work and patience. It requires discernment, a clear head, a clear-eyed capacity for reasoning, unhindered by inflamed passions and disordered desires for power, for money, for fame, for celebrity. It requires we take the longer view, eschewing demands for instantaneous results. As the Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, what one does not understand yet, one can learn. But learning takes time. And until that time is devoted to learning, otherwise possible courses of action are excluded. Only by devoting our time to wide-ranging learning can we inculcate in ourselves what Lonergan goes on to call the unrestricted desire to know, which he says is the antecedent to effective freedom. Time, patience, devotion, discernment, testing, all these lead to effective freedom. Where can we find these things today? Well, we find them, albeit under great pressure in some instances, where Christians have always found them, in universities and schools, and other places of reflection, study, and prayer, including especially monasteries and convents, freed up so far as possible from the demands for instantaneous results, for efficiency and outcomes and assessment. It is then to one such monastery that I want us to spend the rest of our time this evening. This is a monastery in Upper Egypt in the 4th century. This is one of the monasteries, one among many that were founded there in that period, precisely because they were far away from the centers of power and money in the Roman Empire. Places deliberately selected by the pioneering generations of Christians who set up and bequeathed to us the first monastic foundations. These foundations were places where, freed from the distractions of city life, monastics could enter deeply into prayer and study together, seeking insights into the human condition while ultimately seeking deeper communion with God. Of those who did this, in the first rank, we find Evagrius of Pontus. Born in the year 345 and dying in 399, Evagrius was born to a Christian family in Pontus, which today is on the Black Sea coast of modern Turkey. He studied with, or seems to have otherwise been associated with, many of the greats of the 4th century. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, Macarius of Egypt, and Macarius the Great, who was a disciple of St. Anthony the Great. Evagrius became a widely respected and polished rhetorician who went on to become the teacher of John Cassian, to whom Western monasticism is also so heavily indebted. In the latter years of his life, Evagrius, troubled by his own vanity and desire for recognition and respect in the very worldly city of Constantinople, the capital of the empire, and perhaps even more troubled by his disordered desire for a wealthy married woman, moved south, first to a monastery in Jerusalem, and then to a much more remote and austere monastery in Nitria, and then Kella, finally, in Lower Egypt, where he finished out his days. Among the many writings left to us by Evagrius, I will focus on the treatment of the logismi, or the 8 disordered thoughts, which are listed in your handout. Now, you may not have heard of the logismi in these terms, or in this enumeration, but I rather wager that many of you have heard of the 7 deadly sins, yes? Right. That list of 7 was mediated to the West through John Cassian and St. Gregory the Great. Cassian drew extensively on Evagrius in composing his list, but because of the controversy surrounding Evagrius at the time, he never quotes him by name. He's kind of the silent authority in Cassian's writings. In time, Gregory the Great repackaged Evagrius, condensing his original 8 down to 7. He does this by rolling discouragement and sorrow into one, which Gregory calls the sin of sloth. That's a somewhat problematic word in English, I would say, because we tend to assume that it's just a synonym for general laziness, right? But the spiritual writers, Thomas among them, refer to sloth as tristitia da bono spirituale, sadness in the face of a spiritual good. So sloth is more than just I didn't get off the couch today. So he condenses those 2, discouragement and sorrow, into what he calls sloth. And then he takes vainglory and pride and condenses those 2, and then he rounds out to get at 7 by adding envy. So the lists are quite similar, but Gregory does some editing. How does Evagrius arrive at this list, right? How does he come up with this list of 8? Well, he says, all sin begins with excessive self-love and self-regard. From that, we become progressively more entwined with various sinful actions. And that process is often barely conscious. What does it typically look like? Evagrius says, based on observing his own life, as well as the life of people who followed him, who came to him for advice. He says, well, the first step is an assault. A thought, and there's a deliberate ambiguity, I think, in Evagrius. Is it a thought, or in a couple of places he calls it a demon? Is it a thought from within or a demon from without? I think we need to keep both things in mind. Where does it begin? Does it come from somebody outside me, or does it come from within me? It's not always clear, and I think that's deliberate. So I get assaulted by a thought, the ultimate origins of which might not be totally important right here, but I get assaulted. I fool myself into thinking I'm stronger than I am. And so I start to interact with the thought, second stage. Then I move on to consent. I give in to what the thought is suggesting I do. And at this point, the person's in real danger. And it's here that most moralists would say actual sin begins. For after consent comes defeat, as I become hostage to the thought and find it more difficult to resist. The fifth and final stage is passion or obsession, as the thought becomes entrenched reality within the mind and the life of the person. It's important here to note the very different use of the word passion in Evagrius from what we moderns are used to hearing and uttering. It's a banal commonplace in English today, and has been for decades, to describe some interest or other we have as being one of my real passions, right? Cooking, let's say, Notre Dame football, Lawrence Welk memorabilia. Guidance counselors will say, find your passion and make that your career, right? There are no good uses for passion in Evagrius. His whole goal for himself as for us is that we should be without passion. To be, as we would say in English, apathetic, which means, the prefix a in Greek means without pathos, without passion. The goal is to be without passion. Because to be without passion is to be free. Passions are a synonym for these disordered thoughts and desires which enslave me. A passion is not under my rational and spiritual control. The thought controls me. I am its slave. Its thoughts have entered my mind and entangled me, and now I cannot stop acting on its basis. I remember the thought, I repeat it in action, and I cannot work through the underlying disordered desire of my own to be free of this thought. Now, how does this happen? Evagrius says, a thought comes, perhaps from outside, perhaps from your own mind, but from the tempter, ultimately, who leads us astray and wishes for the destruction of everyone. Regardless of the origin, this thought comes and attacks me, it assaults me. And it may be a good thought. That's where we really can't let our guard down. It may be a good thought, right? My boss comes to me and says, you really are the most creative and inventive person in the history of the company. You are the best teacher in the school's mathematics department. You are the holiest sister in the convent. I'm pleased by this. Maybe I know I shouldn't be, but I am, right? It's praise. I start to play with the thought. I entertain it more and more. I invite it in. I toy with it. Gradually, it begins to shape how I think, and worse, how I act. Soon and often, I consent to what it tells me to do, so it moves from thought to action. And then I find myself unable to escape its clutches, becoming obsessed with it and passionate about it, a slave at last. Repeatedly, I may struggle against this enslavement before collapsing into despondency and even despair. Those who have some familiarity with addictions of various sorts will recognize parts of this process. How am I to be freed? How can I get away from this enslavement? It is to free people that Evagrius writes what he does. His is, in fact, a diagnostic system with a therapeutic intent, which is rather ironic because when he moved to the deserts of Egypt, he did so to get away from people. And yet, like much of monastic history, holy people try to get away from people. People discover these holy people in these very obscure places, and then we beat a path to their door. We know they have something that we want, right? So lots of people beat a path to Evagrius, and he tries to help them become freed of their sins. The historian Peter Brown has rather nicely put it when he says, the lonely cells of the recluses of Egypt have been revealed by the archaeologist to have had well-furnished consulting rooms. So in his consulting room, in his cell, Evagrius develops his understanding of the assault that the disordered thoughts pose. He draws on others. It's not totally original. He draws on Origen and earlier Greek writings in Epictetus, Pythagorean literature even, and Philo of Alexandria. But he puts all this together. because he wants to help free people. Now, I would say that Evagrius is Freud before Freud, right? Psychoanalysis avant la lettre. Much as Freud's methods were based on observation of how his own mind worked, consciously and unconsciously via dreams, and on the basis of observing the patients that came to him, so too with Evagrius, 1,500 years before Freud. He observed how his own mind worked, how it interacted with thoughts, how it got trapped by thoughts, and how people coming to him saying, I can't stop this particular sin, what do I do? And he saw the pattern, and then he wrote about it. So how do you get out of this pattern? How do you get away from these sins, these disordered thoughts and desires? How do you get free? Evagrius, like Freud, has the same solution: talk therapy. For Freud, it was what he called the one and really only fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, which is free association. I lie on the couch and I say whatever comes to mind, censoring nothing, withholding nothing, revealing everything. I allow my mind to range freely, even if at first it seems disjointed and to make little sense. Revealing everything, withholding nothing, is a deceptively simple but often, in fact, very difficult rule to observe. Freud said it was his universal experience that he'd no sooner announced this rule to a new patient than the patient immediately climbed up and said, I have nothing to talk about. Observing the rule then requires courage on the part of the analysand and patience on the part of the analyst, who only dimly and slowly begins to perceive underlying patterns of conflict and traumatic memory, which after a time can be brought to the awareness of the patient, who will sometimes resist and fight back, which is also what Evagrius discovered. People come to him, young monks come to him and say, I've really been struggling with this problem for months and years. And Evagrius said, well, maybe this is what's going on underneath the surface. Young monks said, no, you're totally wrong. That can't be happening. That's what Freud called resistance. We don't want to hear what's going on. But talk therapy is what they both propose. For Evagrius, it means having an elder, a spiritual father or mother, to whom we reveal everything, withholding nothing. That person may or may not have been ordained, but that wasn't a priority in the 4th century. The person was primarily chosen not for the possession of sacramental orders, but for having the grace and the gift of discernment and wisdom from the Holy Spirit. Just as a good psychoanalyst even today has recourse to a supervising analyst to analyze the analyst and help with especially difficult cases, so too Evagrius proposed that spiritual elders needed their own elders, to whom they also could and would be totally open. Hence, elders must live in community, right? Monastic community. Because nobody is immune to attacks of the logismi, of the disordered thoughts and desires. That's why, if you want to put it in today's terms, even the Pope goes to confession, right? Priests confess to one another. And even still in some monastic communities today, we have what's called chapter faults, right? A kind of a mutual public confession. Now that being open, as I say, takes courage. It takes even greater humility. But the reward, Evagrius would say, is there's no faster route to defeating the thoughts and the desires. It's secrecy that's the fertile breeding ground for disordered thoughts to take root. It's secrecy that allows abuse and neurosis to fester, according to Freud. Both, therefore, propose you need a skilled physician of mind, soul, and body to whom you can reveal everything. In time, after doing this, you begin to develop the necessary insight on and detachment from the thoughts, and to begin to be free of them. In both Evagrian therapy as in psychoanalysis, there seems to take place what I would call an architectonic shift in the mind, as its structures are rearranged, often very subtly, into newer and healthier forms. For Evagrius, as for Freud, this is a threefold process of liberation. Freud, in a famous essay of the same name, referred to it as remembering, repeating, and working through. Evagrius saw it in very similar ways. First, there's the hard, difficult task of remembering the actual thoughts and taking them to my elder and repeating them, beginning to weaken their power because I've revealed them. This, after a time, opens up some new free space in which I can begin to turn the focus from myself and my thoughts and my struggles outward to where it belongs, to contemplate God's creation. Only after this, in the third phase, do I move to what Evagrius calls theologia, or theology, in the strict sense, another word that's used very differently in Evagrius and indeed in the whole Greek patristic tradition from how we use it today. For Evagrius, theology is not an academic discipline primarily. It is simply direct contemplation of God. My mind has been freed of my disordered thoughts and desires, and therefore has the capacity, the space, the room to contemplate God. So this is a threefold process of moving from dark, enclosed, cramped, sinful, inward-focused self out into the light and ultimately into the good, which is God himself. And that kind of threefold process has become a commonplace in monastic and mystical literature, ancient and modern, in both the East and the West. It's also been recognized, I think, in some more contemporary psychoanalytic thought. Fred Bush, for example, recent book, Creating a Psychoanalytic Mind, which I mentioned on your bibliography, has outlined a very similar process. He says we begin with self-observation, we then move to self-reflection, and then finally we come to self-inquiry, which begins to turn away from the inward focus outwards. It's this kind of self-inquiry and self-interrogation that I think we need more of in an age of fake news and disordered desires. For the ability to deceive others and to be deceived by them begins with our own disordered desire to do so. Convincing others, usually for motives of avarice, vainglory, pride, or fornication. These four, together with gluttony, sorrow, anger, and discouragement, are Evagrius's 8 logismi. And I would suggest keep that list handy as we struggle to understand what is real and truthful and trustworthy in the world today and what is not. All 8 of these can be and are regularly but subtly exploited to sell us things. Whether a new car, an anti-cholesterol medication, a dieting website or gym membership, an Iraq war or two, or the latest claim about Russian hacking. What are the people propagating these things trying to stir up in us? As McIntyre and Marx both suggested, part of the brilliance of capitalist systems is their enormous powers of disguise, their unprecedented and superlative ability to keep hidden from us these mechanisms of manipulation, these internal structures by which they subtly co-opt our desires and even more subtly corrupt their critics, invading their enemies and colonizing their imaginations from within. Perhaps even more frustrating is their ability to sow good seed among bad, so that in criticizing the latter, one is often accused of criticizing the former, or at least of being insufficiently grateful for it. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about. How many millions of dollars a year are made on selling books, websites, and gadgets promoting mindfulness or spirituality? What are those things? They're commodities. That's what they've become. They're commodities. There's no such thing as spirituality. There's no such thing as spirituality until and unless you can turn it into something you can make money off of. And then, after the Industrial Revolution, spirituality gets spun off into a commodity, invented, marketed, and then exploited for profit. It's not to say that buying a book or a rosary or putting an icon up at home or a statue of the Mother of God in your garden is a bad thing and that you shouldn't pay money for those things. But why have these things become commodities? Well, McIntyre and Marx would say that capitalism has these great powers of turning even good things into commodities. But we don't often recognize that that is happening. So the powers of persuasion and commodification are often hidden from us. Perhaps worse, they're often conjoined to or otherwise engaged by the Leviathan, which is the modern nation state, and its vast powers of surveillance, regulation, and war-making. McIntyre is then right to insist that Marx and Freud together remain very useful in this world of ours, to sniff out the powers and principalities of the world and their hidden mechanisms of control, violence, and greed, what St. Augustine famously called libido dominandi. While recognizing the prosperity that capitalism has brought some, McIntyre also insists in his latest book on recognizing that it has destroyed traditional ways of life, created gross and sometimes grotesque inequalities of income and wealth, lurched through crisis after crisis, creating recurrent mass unemployment, and left those areas and communities that it was not profitable to develop permanently impoverished and deprived. Even when it's not been ravaging communities and colonizing the imagination of too many American Christians from within, see, for example, the prosperity gospel, it has done harm, McIntyre says, precisely by succeeding. In the updated 1995 preface to his book Marxism and Christianity, McIntyre writes, "Capitalism is bad for those who succeed by its standards as well as for those who fail by them, something that many preachers and theologians have failed to recognize, and those Christians who have recognized it have often enough been at odds with ecclesiastical as well as political and economic authorities." And here I would suggest one thinks immediately of Dorothy Day. So how can we begin to detect when our desires are being exploited by people seeking to make money, by power mongers in government, opinion makers in the media? How can we begin to tell that they're peddling, if not fake news, then claims with hidden agendas, playing off, exploiting, manipulating our own disordered tendencies and fallen human nature? Well, I would suggest look at your own reaction, first of all. Has the latest headline or TV commercial or web ad or executive order from the White House or a congressional debate provoked in you thoughts or feelings of gluttony, fornication, avarice, sorrow, discouragement, anger, vainglory, or pride? Do those publishing the debates and the ads and the commercials seek to exploit our weaknesses in any of these 8? Do they stand to gain monetarily thereby? Will their power, prestige, and pride increase thereby? What is the solution to all this? Right? People like McIntyre and Marx are often accused of, well, you've got tremendous criticism you've advanced here, but what's your solution, right? What's the alternative? Well, there isn't one. If we're looking for another mass-produced commodity that will magically solve all these problems, there's no website of fact-checkers to solve this. There's no pharmaceutical truth serum to be invented and marketed. There's no way to guarantee true over fake news. For the human condition, perpetually wounded by original sin, will always be vulnerable to deceptions of our own devisings, to say nothing of others. Perhaps the closest we can come to an answer is to never stop learning from Marx and Freud, to be as they were, perpetually restless and skeptical of our own inherent and lavish propensity for self-indulgent half-truths, for disguising things from ourselves, never mind each other. When asked privately late in life whether a psychoanalysis could ever end in theory rather than in practice, Freud said no. Now, he didn't do this to keep patients on the hook, right, paying him in perpetuity. He said that because he realized that the human mind has an endless capacity, even late in life, by otherwise well-analyzed, well-reasoning people, to collapse once more into deception. The desire then to be free of all neuroses, of all desires, is rarely obtained, as Evagrius knew alongside Freud. And that is, St. Paul would suggest, part of the providence of God. For he keeps us struggling against our disordered desires to preserve us from a greater peril. As St. Paul writes in his second letter to the Corinthians, "And to keep me from being too elated by the abundance of revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I besought the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' I will all the more gladly boast of my weaknesses then, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." The apostle thus joins with Freud and Evagrius to put before us a simple and yet sometimes hard and unattractive practice that ends only with the grave. That is, to interrogate ourselves, to know ourselves thoroughly, and then to begin via humble and unsparing confession and analysis the process of freeing ourselves from the disordered thoughts which hold us in their grip, all the while content to rest in the grace and the power of the Lord, and not in the fake news we tell ourselves about our own supposed strength. The way we avoid being prisoners of our own desires, and thus victims of having those desires exploited by those in politics, in capital, and in media, is by moving towards a state of passionlessness, of being without passion, without desires that we cannot control while others can and do. As the monastic and scholar Columbus Stewart has argued, the freedom of apatheia was not selfish. It meant the opening of the self to others and to God, the unclenching of the hand, grasping what it desires or fending off those who are a threat. Thus we realize that our own liberation is not solitary or individualistic, but communal. As McIntyre would say, one of the hallmarks of a good reasoner who is freed from his unconscious passions and disordered desires is that he or she has come to recognize the unbreakable connections between my good and goods, the common good, and the ultimate good who is God. Capitalism thrives on dividing, on keeping things separate, on promoting selfish, acquisitive individualism. But a healthy mind, functioning well, sees and understands the connections and knows that my good is always linked with the good of others, with the common good, and with the ultimate good who is God. All of those are linked. A sound mind, to use Cardinal Newman's famous phrase, understands that all knowledge forms one whole. Evagrius, as a monastic living in a community, would agree entirely. He would see and say that my good and goods are indeed bound up with the good and goods of others, as we together in this community seek the good who is God. And we do that by breaking down the walls of separation and secrecy that allow our desires to thrive in the first place in unhealthy and disordered ways. This breaking down is not, however, the final step. It is but the prelude to all of us being able to gather in freedom and communion in the presence of the Trinity. Evagrius writes, when the mind, after having stripped off the old man, has been reclothed in the new one who comes from grace, then it will see its state at the moment of prayer, similar to sapphire or to the color of the sky. This is what Scripture describes as the place of God on Mount Sinai. On Mount Sinai, there is no fake news. There's no deceiving of ourselves or others, for we are in the presence of the one who is truth himself, who brings his people out of all forms of slavery, internal and external, and smashes all the idols of sex, money, and power. We can, even today, begin to ascend Mount Sinai if we are willing to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves and each other about our desires, and to refuse to hide them, and thereby allow others the power to exploit them. Marx, Freud, and Evagrius all remain useful to us as thorns in our side, pricking us whenever we blindly or smugly believe we have nothing to hide. They come to us then as now with their acids of suspicion, dissolving our propensity for fake news about ourselves and our world, so that the one who has redeemed us in our world can make his good news heard after all. Thank you.